if the kid has a certain pattern of learning, if they are more auditory learner versus visual learner, we try to coach the parents and the teachers on how this kid is most receptive to the information. We also tell them, don't be automatic in your response to their behavior. That's where a lot of kids get inappropriately punished or put in a corner of bad behavior, when the parent might really need to be more aware and understand that this kid, and I can tell you stories. I mean, I've also coached kids sports, and I can tell you those kids that pick up daisies on the baseball field should be evaluated for ADHD, because they might actually be losing the instructions from the coach as to what they're saying. And you don't really punish them. You have ways where they can be engaged in the process, the way you talk to them.
So I've read that there are a lot of very famous people who've had symptoms of ADD. Stephen Hawking, Leonardo da Vinci, President Eisenhower, Winston Churchill, Mozart. Well, we don't know. They didn't have doctors looking into that then, but apparently they had the symptoms.
The brain is an amazing organ. That's why I love the brain. In case you haven't noticed. So this is the brain. If you really look at what we know now with the modern science, we know 10,000 more than when I was going through medical school. And that was in the dinosaur age. Okay? So we can tell you each area of the brain. So if you look at ADHD, you see this is the right side, this is the back of the brain, this is the front. The prefrontal area of the right hemisphere is most implicated in an area called dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So if you go, there are billions of synapses there. If you go inside them, there is a dopamine. You hear of chemicals, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin. There is a dopamine deficiency in the conduction in those areas. So people get distracted, disorganized, but to compensate, other areas of the brain really take over. So oftentimes, if the kid is untreated and goes into adulthood, you have anxiety, obsessive tendencies to compensate for that. So keep in mind, if they're smart, the rest of the brain is working really well. If in some areas, and we know not to generalize, but the right side of the brain is considered the creative brain versus the analytic on the left side. So a lot of creative people, whether they have ADHD or not, have very well developed ways of expressing themselves. A lot of the artists have it, but also a lot of the famous politicians and others have the condition and they compensate. So just think, if they didn't have the diagnosis of the treatment and they did arguably well, I mean, you can certainly politically criticize some of those people, but they were able to do it. Just think of what the brain can do when this area is appropriately managed.
My goodness.
It's remarkable.
Well, can that part of the brain ever be damaged through, say, concussions or maybe during childbirth? Or do they know what causes?
Well, I think you're raising a great question. So there are 4 things we look at as to what contributes to ADHD. Certainly, neurobiology is one, which I touched on, the norepinephrine and dopamine. But brain damage is definitely, we're now seeing, one of the other areas I work with is pregnancy and women's health in pregnancy. Because there's more and more evidence if the mother is ill in pregnancy, or taking certain street drugs or prescription medications, everything goes to the placenta, to the brain development of the baby. And there's evidence, for example, that alcohol, tobacco, street drugs can have damaging effect on the brain and produce ADHD syndrome, autism spectrum, etc. There's also evidence of trauma in early childhood. Let's say premature birth, or complicated birth where the cord was around the neck, or ischemia to the brain in delivery. Those can have an impact. There's also syndromes that can happen after they're born, if they were born normally. So head injury. Now, as you know, concussion has been a big item on the news. because the brain is a delicate organ, and if you bruise and damage that area of the brain, whether it's a baseball hitting in that area or a football injury, it can certainly affect attention. We see a lot of TBIs now, traumatic brain injury, with veterans, with sports related, so absolutely. So then genetics we talked about, and so these are kind of gives you the full range. One other thing I want to address, which you didn't ask, is the syndrome of inattentiveness can be caused by other medical conditions. But to diagnose ADHD, you have to have an indication of development in childhood. For example, I saw a young man who came to me and he was a perfect A student, no problem, and he developed attentional problems in his mid-20s for the first time ever. And I confirmed with family member. That condition was caused by anxiety, not ADHD. Older people sometimes, I see people in their 50s and 60s who come in and says, Doc, I think I'm having dementia or Alzheimer's. And when I really evaluate them, they don't have a degenerative condition. They have an accentuated ADHD that's getting worse as we age. That has never been detected earlier. So the treatment really is going to change significantly.
This has been wonderful. I'm so happy you came to explain to us some things about ADD. And I hope you'll come back and teach us many more things about these brain disorders, neurological disorders. I call them all kinds of things.
I think we're more into looking at them as interconnected rather than segregated conditions.
Okay.
So like I emphasize when somebody introduces Dr. Shaker as a psychiatrist, says, yeah, thank you, I am board certified psychiatrist, but I'm trained in medicine, neurology, and psychiatry. Because it's important to recognize the head is not a detached organ. The nervous system is every millimeter of the body. And if you have nervous system disturbances, whether it's biological or electromagnetic, it can impact you with pain, with medical conditions. So I am really delighted to let you know that the mental health spectrum is part of physical health, and it should be addressed in similar ways and not discriminated against, because we can make superstars in individuals who might have difficulties because of their genetics or their background. We can fix that. As a matter of fact, a lot of the famous athletes have ADHD. You didn't ask me about that, but I volunteer, like Olympic stars or superstar basketball players, because if they compensate and they excel in a certain area, they're really wonderfully adjusted people. So my message to your audience is look at it in a full spectrum way, evaluate medically, psychologically, behaviorally, neurochemically, and fix all of that needs to be fixed.
That's wonderful, and I'm glad you're doing that.